All right. So today we're going to continue a discussion about the release of the first version of the equitable decision intelligence model for emergency management. And our session will focus on using data and technology to improve equity in your organizations, your institutions, et cetera, and really improve equity outcomes in the communities that we serve. As most of you may know, this collective effort is hosted by Spain Global, Forecast, the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, IDIEM, and the International Association of Emergency Managers, IAEM. I want to give special thanks to IAEM Emerging Technology Committee for hosting this event, and to our very own Sarah Miller, the board liaison and IAEM Region 10 president, for her leadership, contributions, and all the guidance throughout this process. All right, so here a little bit of an overview for today. Really, today's session will focus on introducing the first open source equity model. And as you know, this is the first version. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of it as we continue to release future models. Second, we want to discuss ways to use the equity model in your organization. And lastly, to have a better understanding on how to access and use Github documentation. All right, and here a little bit of an overview of resources. So this is based on our previous webinars and workshops. We want to ensure that you are familiar with some of the things and resources that we have to access information and to stay connected to this effort. Some of you may have already seen this, but I want to go over some of them for ease of reference, and then we will talk about them at the end of the presentation as well. So at the beginning, you see here, if you have any questions and want more information, you can email us at equity@spainglobal.org. Right now, we're hosting weekly equity model ideation conversations every Thursday for 30 minutes. And really, there's an opportunity to contribute your suggestions and requirements for future model versions. And this is every Thursday, and it's an opportunity to bring your expertise and your experiences based on gaps and issues that you're seeing around equity, and just have a brainstorming session and contribute to the model. So we'll go through the model, talk about it, and this will really help us as we continue in developing the future models. To access the content on GitHub, we're going to include the links in the chat. And third, if you are from the government, or if you know of any agency or jurisdictions who may be interested in a functional pilot, we'll include the link to sign up for a functional pilot. Or you can email us as well. And basically this will just serve as proofs of concept as we continue working on this model. So if you're interested, please let us know. If you haven't attended any of our previous events, we've hosted workshops and webinars, and we'll include the link to a YouTube video for the first hour of a workshop that we hosted a few months ago, where you can watch the first hour of it and basically see how we lay the groundwork for this effort and talk about some scenarios and how things may look like with this effort. And then lastly, we have a LinkedIn group that we're going to be using more to collaborate and share resources, and then just create this community of practice that we're trying to accomplish, throughout this effort. And the name is Equitable Decision Intelligence for Emergency Management. So if you want to join that on LinkedIn, please do so after this webinar. All right, well, I'm going to now turn it over to Sarah Miller, who will be leading most of this session. The floor is yours, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is a really great attendance. I think that's what you do when you invite emergency managers to hear from other emergency managers. You all came. I do want to recognize the fact that there are several people here from IAEM's Emerging Technology Committee, so thank you for coming. And several people I see from Region 10, my home region. So thank you all very much for coming, and to the rest of you too, because this is an important effort. And it is, as you might have gathered from what Camille said, this is not something we just started. We've been working on this for a while now, and we've done some modeling, and Nissim's going to talk about some of that. But I think it's important to sort of set the groundwork here for why we collectively think this is important. And I'm sure you've all at some point seen stories, reports, experienced yourself or experienced in your communities inequitable service delivery, meaning that the services we provide as emergency managers do not equitably reach everyone who needs them. And I know for the last 10 years, 11 years, we've bandied about the term whole community, but we haven't necessarily done a good job of implementing it. We've done really the best we can do in a lot of cases, but we have the ability to do better looking at technology. And so you look, obviously Hurricane Katrina is one of the largest examples of inequitable service delivery. When we talk about inequities, we're talking about people not receiving the services that they need, which should have been available to them. And historically, the most inequitable service delivery happens among people of color, among low-income populations, and among people who are already in some ways disconnected from the system, as I would call it. And so it's important to understand what that looks like in your own community. Like, we can look and tell you what it looks like on a large scale basis, but you have to look and really look at what that has meant in your own community. Who has not had the ability to fully access whatever services are being delivered in the response portion of an incident? And then particularly in recovery, I think we see a lot of these things happen in recovery when people just can't access what we're doing. And so we have data. We have piles and piles and piles of data. You're surrounded by data. You have it everywhere. It's in file cabinets, it's in boxes, it's on computers. You have data, but it is extraordinarily challenging to try and do something with that data by hand, especially in the middle of an incident, or when you have a time crunch, or when you don't have someone dedicated to manually peruse that data. There's a lot that we can know, but it's the process of going through that data, compiling the data, making connections with the data that tell us a story about the communities that we serve. And we know historically emergency management has a really hard time implementing technology. We are behind the curve, and it's a government issue unless you're DoD, where you get lots of money to do really cool stuff. The rest of us are stuck with whatever we can afford, whatever we can convince our policymakers to let us buy. And we don't historically have a good track record in emergency management of identifying, scoping, procuring, implementing, training on technology platforms. And so we have this ability to access tons of data, but we don't have the actual ability to do it. So the data is there, we can learn a lot from it, but we tend to not do that. And I'm sure that you've probably experienced that at some point, where you're trying to compile data. There's a lot of it out there, and it is overwhelming if you don't have some tool to process it. I think we all know intuitively that we want to do a better job. We need to do a better job. We want to be able to equitably provide services, but how do we do that? A lot of what we end up doing is in hindsight. It's people who let us know that they were not served in the way that they felt they should be. And the goal of this is to really identify upfront better ways to serve our community. So it starts by better understanding of who is in our community, who's there in the first place, and how do our events and incidents impact them. When you're doing planning, particularly mitigation planning, how are you accounting for past inequities in your system? Those often don't show up in our after action reports. If you look at your after action reports, does it say anything like, and we inequitably provided this service to the community? It probably doesn't. Or it's in some draft after action report that never made it past the legal department and is sitting in a folder somewhere, never to be made public, because it's a draft form, because it's hard to own up sometimes to our need for improvement. How about that? And so when we look then at applying technology to solutions, we don't necessarily know what it is we need. If you talk to emergency managers, they know that there are solutions. We know that there are solutions, but what are those? Nobody's told us or trained us or given us the education we need to figure out what we need, how to properly scope it out, how to acquire it, how to implement it, how to train on it, and how to use it. And these skills are these skills expire. So what you knew 5 years ago about technology, if you haven't kept up, it's changed dramatically in 5 years. It's changed dramatically in the last year. Imagine 5 years ago talking about everyone in government going and working remote. We would have all been laughed at. That was not, we were told for years, it is not possible to do that. And yet it was possible and we did it, but we didn't get to plan well for it. And so those things happen in technology on a continuing basis. And so we want, part of the goal of this is to come up with a way that we can better access data, we can better learn things from data, and we can better apply what we learn to the communities we're trying to serve in all phases of what we do. So how can we better apply preparedness? How can we better plan for mitigation? How can we better respond or plan for response? And how can we better plan in advance for recovery in ways that adequately address equity within our communities? And I will say this too, if you have questions, you can pop them into the chat. I'm likely to see them, though it might take me a minute. I really welcome that. And sorry, Camilla, go ahead with the next slide. I forgot I was supposed to say next slide. So let's talk a little bit about data. Data is everywhere. We are data. The fact that we're on this call, when this call is done, there will be metrics to provide the call host about data. How many people signed on? How many people stayed for the entire time? What the average engagement was? That is data that we could then theoretically use to build better webinars in the future. Data, however, is not neutral. Data is built by people, and people are biased. Every one of us is biased in some ways about some things. Sometimes we know it and acknowledge it. Sometimes we know it and we don't acknowledge it. And sometimes we don't know that we are biased. It is easy to make assumptions about things, and those assumptions often are based on our past experience or what we have learned, and they don't necessarily reflect an equitable viewpoint. You have to actually make steps and do concrete work to build equity into your systems, to look for bias. And so when you look at data, it's just a bunch of stuff. And you have to make sense of it, and you have to acknowledge where it came from. If your data set, for example, maybe you've gathered data about people who've accessed the healthcare system and what they've done when they accessed it. There's inherent bias in there because it doesn't account for anybody who didn't access the healthcare system. So it doesn't account for the people who couldn't make it to their doctor's appointment because they didn't have transportation, or who never decided to go to a doctor because they don't have health insurance. All of those people are excluded from the data of who went to the doctor or who accessed healthcare. And so building that, accounting for that bias and recognizing the bias is a first piece of how you have to start building for equity. Recognizing what's not in your data is really important, and recognizing where your data might favor certain groups of people over others. Due to access, due to fear, due to trust, due to whatever, you have to recognize what that data is, and you have to recognize why the data was collected. It doesn't mean that the data is bad, but it means that it was collected for a purpose that is not your purpose. If we're going to collect data ourselves for something, we're going to build a data collection method that tries to account for the variables that we're trying to capture. But when we look at other people's data, we have to account for what they're trying to capture, which we have different purposes for gathering data. And so it's important to look at what you're trying to do with the data and really identify gaps in what you have gathered and how you have gathered it. We like to look at the fact that there's tons of data available. If you want to make decisions about your community, you can get data from hospital systems, you can get data from public health, you can get data from school districts, you can get data from your utilities department, you can get data from your food bank, from your senior center. There's tons of places that have data that is available to you, but you have to look at why it was gathered and account for that. And one of the things that we tend to do, and this is across all technology, we tend to really overlook the question of what does my solution, or who does my solution not serve? We tend to do a lot of things that center around what we can do, what we can accomplish, what our solution fixes, but we don't tend to look at what's left out. And that's, I think, a key to how we've gotten to this place where we really recognize inequities in our system. We haven't spent enough time asking the question about who's not represented, who's not here, who's not in the data, who is clearly not missing. And I like to describe this sometimes by a very simple analogy. And imagine that you have a dashboard, a real-time dashboard about disaster, and there's a disaster in your community, and you're gathering data from your 911 system, and you're gathering data from your public works people, and you're gathering data from social media, and you're plotting it all on a map. And that map tells you a lot. It tells you where a whole bunch of bad things are happening, tells you where maybe things aren't so bad. But in the middle of the map, there's a giant gap where there's zero data. There's no one reporting anything from that gap. You can make two assumptions about that. You can assume everything's fine there and there's nothing to worry about. Or you can assume that things are so bad there that we need to go check and put eyes on and figure out why there's no information. And so that's the piece of that who's not being served by my solution. That who's not being served in that little scenario is the people in the gap, the people where there's no information are clearly not being served because we don't know what's going on. And so we can visually identify that in that example, and then we can go send someone to look and see what's going on instead of just responding to what we know. And we tend very much to respond to what we know. It's what we do. And so making a conscious effort to identify gaps, to identify where we can do better is a critical piece of how we unbias our data. It takes effort. And so you look at technology and how technology is built. Most technology is not built with an equity mindset. It's just built to serve a purpose. Your blender wasn't created to serve an equity purpose. It's just a blender. But there are things that we can do to make that blender better for other people. And so when you think about that, you think about how to make the system better for other people, and you think about that in a technology sense, and it changes the way that technologists can think about their technology, but also about how it can change the way end users think about how they access that technology. And so when we don't take that effort, make that effort, we end up with technology that does not account for diversity, and it ultimately leads to inequitable programs and outcomes. And that is the key around which we're trying to build this model. We have to account for diversity in every piece of our development of any program we're doing to ensure that we are getting the best outcomes for our community. And that is, the immediate thought is, oh, that's going to take a lot more work. Yes, it absolutely is going to take more work. Building equity into a system that is not inherently built for equity takes work. And so what we're really hoping to do is build out this model to help inform decision makers about where their gaps are, where they can make improvements, what their community actually looks like, and where there are already gaps that need to be filled. That in itself will lead to better outcomes ultimately when we're trying to build our emergency management programs. And it is really a challenge. And I think I'm watching some really great comments here in chat about books to read and resources to look at. Those are helpful to inform your process. One of the things that I want to very much point out is the fact that we're talking about artificial intelligence to do this, but that's not HAL, the computer that decides to kill us all. That is a decision tool. It's taking data, it's analyzing what we have so that we can make decisions. And we're not allowing a system to make decisions for us. We're allowing a system to better inform us in our decision-making process. because that may help remove some of the bias from our own selves. If the system says, hey, did you know that you have something going on in here where the majority of the people being served are white, and yet the majority of people in your community are BIPOC, the system can point out to you that maybe there's an error, and you can investigate and start to make better decisions with that. Artificial intelligence is not the scary thing that you see on TV. We're nowhere near that. This is a decision-making tool, just like anything else. And the reality is, you could, in fact, do this exact same work with a bunch of pencils and a bunch of paper and a calculator, but it would take you a very, very long time. And doing this with artificial intelligence lets us create models that update in near real time based on the fact that we have new and improved data coming all the time. It's not a static point in time. So I see your question, David, and if emergency management is slow or doesn't implement technology in the first place, how does this apply? Well, it doesn't. You can't use artificial intelligence decision-making if you're not going to use technology. But what we're saying is we're trying to create a model that makes it easy for you to implement and make better decisions. And that's the point of this, is to make this accessible. And Nissim's going to get into the details of it, but go ahead and go to the next slide, Camille. So this is what it looked like when we built this model. We built the model to reflect the fact that we need help in making decisions. We need broad perspectives from a wide range of communities. We need the depth of knowledge that comes from experienced emergency managers and experienced technologists, because they can both point to issues we might have. We needed to incorporate the lived experiences of the people who have lived through the disasters, who have experienced inequitable service delivery. And we built a model that is purposely inclusive. And I think that's the key. We built this so that we are recognizing that what has happened in the past has not necessarily been equitable, and we need it to be so. And so part of this is trying to create something that actually moves the needle forward on equity. Like we're way behind in a lot of ways. And so we're trying to move the needle forward incrementally. And this is one approach to do that. And part of this is open source. There's no mystery back there. There's no secret algorithm that is, it's not like some of the large purveyors of data on the internet who just tell you things and their data is a secret. The entire model for this is open source. Anybody can look at how it's built. I say anybody. You probably need to be a programmer to understand some of it because it's complicated, but anyone with that knowledge set can look and see how it's built, see what it was designed to do, and make recommendations for improvement. That's the beauty of open source technology. And so we are very much looking to fix this problem in the long term. Like, this is not a, oh, we're gonna implement this AI and tomorrow all of our equity issues are going to be gone. That is not how it works. It is a long-term solution. And David, I'm actually going to address that because this is not a thing that the lone emergency manager with no technology background can do on their own. This requires a team. This requires a team of people, maybe from universities, maybe from some local citizens local residents who want to be part of this. This is not a lone solution because it requires technology to implement, requires somebody to gather the data. This is everything in emergency management ends up being a team effort. This is no different. You're looking to build a team. And I think Nissim's going to talk a little bit about that, but ultimately you need IT people. You probably need a programmer. You need a data expert. You need emergency managers to help implement this in your community. It is not a plug and play. It is open source, but open source does not mean you install it on your computer and it magically works. Open source means that anyone can see how it works. Anyone can contribute to the solution, but it does not mean it is something you just plug in and use. It's sort of like building a building. It's like, great, we're going to build a building. I'm just going to go do that as the emergency manager. No, you're going to hire an architect. You're going to get a project manager. Those people are going to hire other people to do things to make sure that your building gets built. And this is much the same. It's not something you're just going to do overnight. It takes a group of people to implement, gather data, input data, and come up with a solution. And I would say that probably if you want to do this, then partnering with a university, someone who's nearby you. We're going to talk a little bit. I think Nissan's going to talk about looking for some test sites, or maybe Camilla. Somebody's going to talk about looking for other test sites to roll this out with. But this is a proof of concept model. Like, we are very much in what I would call beta mode with this. We're still trying it out, still fine tuning it. But Nissim's going to talk and show you what this looks like. And I think this is where I move. Oh, let's see. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. So this is our model development. And this talks about what our professional recommendations were. So you can, I'm not going to read it to you, but it talks about the data structures. What's the recommendation? How are we going to measure it? How are we going to calculate that? Where's it going to go in this data file? And what's the name of it going to be? And so this is built on this is the open source model. This is the model that you can look at and see how this was built. Go ahead to the next slide. So, yeah, so this is where I got ahead a little bit. So there's a technical side to the open source model, and there's a non-technical side. Typically your emergency managers are going to be the non-technical specialists who are going to give input to this and how it's built. And then we have the technical side, which was it was all of our nerds. So all of the people with development skills, with data analysis skills, with programming skills, put all of these things together to create this model. And go ahead to the next slide, if you would, Camilla. So this, we're going to talk briefly about GitHub. GitHub is where this entire package lives. You can download it, you can use it, but you need to get the right people together to do that. This requires a team of people. Like I said, it requires certain skills. It requires certain knowledge sets. But this data dictionary on GitHub looks at what the key KPIs are. So the key performance indicators. What is it that we're trying to do? What are the metrics that we're trying to measure, calculate, and do something with? And so that those metrics are those are how we measure. What is it we're measuring? Is it people? Is it experience? Is it money? What is it that we're going to measure? And what are we going to do with that? And so the metrics for this can come from a lot of places. So I mentioned earlier about the places we gather data from now, but a lot of times we're not gathering it in a way that it can be integrated with other bits of data and be analyzed. We're just gathering it. We're doing some assessment of it, and we are making some assessments on it in a much more disparate way. And so when in the platform that this is built on, which is the forecast platform right now, it's taking all of this data and making sense of it in some way that is useful to us. When it comes to diversity, when it comes to equity, when it comes to inclusion, that is what this model is doing. So when you start looking at the types of data that are getting pulled in and analyzed, this is what we're looking for. So we're trying to understand like the diversity component. We're acknowledging, understanding, accepting, valuing, and respecting the variety of characteristics that make individuals unique. How do you tell a computer to do that? That's a challenge. And that's where this model comes in. And Nissim's going to get into what this looks like and how it works. But ultimately, we have taken knowledge of individuals and built it into a model so that we can give it data and it can help us make decisions. It can come to conclusions. We can look at those conclusions and sort of have a sense that they are correct and because of the data that we put in. The source for these definitions, this came out of our focus groups and other sources. So they're kind of amalgamations of definitions. I assume you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and what those mean. Yeah. All right, with that, I think that is my last slide for real this time, and I'm going to hand it over to Nissim.
Thank you, Sarah. So before I share my screen and show a little bit the model, I just want to connect to all the information that you gave now. A little bit about our model and how it's going to work. Of course, it's an open source model. The idea is that, AI becomes transparent. Everyone can go inside, understand how we build it, what's the idea, what's the data, what are we collecting. But to provide, better insights, to provide decision intelligence for decision makers, we build the model in three different layers, where the idea is building the first layer, that is let's call it the model, the preparedness model layer, where we build all the metrics, the KPIs, the model as a framework of collecting data that can support our decision-making processes. The second layer is the layer where we run this model against real-world situations, different scenarios that we can have, floods, wildfires, because we're speaking about emergency management. And the third one is actually putting operational insights from people, from the different workshops, lunch and learns, webinars that we're doing for a while, so that we can really support decision makers when they want to think about what they should do according to their community. The idea is starting from the end, asking the right questions. What is the goal of this model? What does it need to answer? What does it need to support? And like Sarah mentioned, there's a lot of bias in the data. And when we go to the end and ask the question and build the model according to it, so the big part of the model is like a lot of different questions that we need to validate this data. We need to take bias out of this data. And with your permission, I'm going to share my screen and show a few parts of the model itself. Okay, so what we're seeing here is I'll speak about the basics of the model, and then we can go to Github and explain it a little bit more. So the idea here was, focusing on equity and diversity in emergency management, where we try to touch each of the pillars of emergency management, mitigation, preparedness, response, and drilling down to each and one of them. You can see different metrics that came from BREAK program policy recommendations, assessing social vulnerability, for example, where the idea is collecting data from a lot of sources. So of course, the basic data that we were going to look at is GIS, demographic data, social data, census data, historical data about different events, different lessons learned from the past, but also a lot of regulations, a lot of different surveys. So the idea of a model is like when you build a model, you build really a template or an infrastructure that you can collect data in the right way. You can ask, what kind of data should I collect? And the idea is that this data should provide decision intelligence insights to decision makers. Where you see here where it says comments and recommendations, that's part of building the data. When we start building the model, and this is why we're having all the different workshops and lunch and learns, is trying to input to the model the operational mind, speaking to a lot of people from the operational side before we go to the technical side of it, understanding from their experience what they have learned in the past, what happened in different events, what kind of lessons learned they had, and you can drill down. And the model that I'm showing you here is fully open in Github. And the idea is that we want to provide a lot of insights from the community, from different people. As much as we get more information, I think that we can validate a better model in the future. And the idea is that if you guys will go to Github, and probably Camila or Brian will share later on a link to the Github model. So you will see here two models. The TDS is just crowd behavior. You can also go inside it, but you can go into the decision intelligence model that Sarah just described. This part is more for technical people, the calculations, the events, the different things that you can go inside, but you also have the data dictionary that explains, what's a model, how is this model built, what's the framework, the different attributes, the different KPIs that we've built, the different metrics. And the idea here is trying to build each metric is like a question, what I'm asking about. For example, in preparedness, so lifelines are different metrics, and transportation lifelines and different metrics that, being calculated to some kind of KPI. And you have entities and tags and activities types. And the idea here is, as you drill down, you will see the different parts, the different pillars, like I mentioned, from mitigation and preparedness and response and recovery, and drill down to each and every one of them and see, like prevention models or mitigation models. And in each one of them, we put a lot of different metrics from a lot of inputs from our discussions with a lot of different people regarding diversity, regarding equity. For example, areas with, low-income communities that get a lot of damage. How is our emergency management team prepared to work with the community? How do we train our community, the relations with our community? Do we have, a community that speaks a lot of Spanish? Do we have someone in our team that speaks Spanish? Different examples that came out from a lot of, I believe, a lot of experience, and a lot of things, that people learned in the past. So the idea is that you have this model here. You can drill down to version 1 of it. The idea in version 1 is that we have the index name of each metric. We have the model, the KPI, the metric. We have we calculate it. There's a full calculation model. But the most important thing to validate this data, to take bias out of this data, is this recommendations. These recommendations now are a lot of recommendations that came from different lunch and learns that Eric and Brian did with a lot of different emergency managers. And the idea is that as much as we input data, later on, if you remember, I spoke about 3 layers of the model. Then the AI layer, it's a learning layer. It's a layer that works for the technical people. It works based on Markov chains. And the idea is teaching this model. And when we teach this model according to how we work, how our doctrine behaves, what happens from lessons learned in the past, how does an emergency management work, how is diversity and equity taking in mind in all these issues. So all these recommendations become, with time, become a AI recommendation. So it's actually decision intelligence supporting our emergency management decision makers powered by AI. And it can be fully transparent. So at each time we can see, like Sarah mentioned, near real-time recommendations. And like she spoke about the gap, the places that we don't know what's happening, this will happen during an event. But if we build this model correctly, in the preparedness phase, we will understand how we're prepared in every area, where we have vulnerabilities, where is our problems, and also if in real time we don't have the picture of each area, we can run the AI model to get some kind of better understanding. So it won't be 100%. Remember, it's a machine, but it can be, 80, 85%, and we can send ourselves to check those areas. That's all from my side, Sarah, unless you want to add something, or Eric.
If Nisim, you want to briefly talk about this based on the 6 base models. I mean, you really talked to the GitHub, and then which is already.
Okay, so we published a full framework of the model. We're publishing also different, let's call it, basic models, or much little models based on different subjects, like community lifelines, incident response, mitigation. And like we spoke, for now, we started implementing mainly equity and diversity in the mitigation process, in the preparedness process, and in the response itself. And hopefully, as we get more of your insights inside, we will have a much better model. It's very important if we get, a lot of different, POCs, or different, states, communities, counties, cities, that we can work together and understand better the sources of data that they have, the problems that they get. It's very interesting, hearing everyone, those are, how can we call it, lessons learned from blood and from experience that people did in the field. And as we train this model better, it will be, a much better model, and it will be, as close as we can for supporting our decision makers. Another important thing that I want to mention, a lot of times it comes out from discussions, mainly with Eric, is that a lot of time emergency managers can support, their decision makers, the stakeholders with a lot of information, and it's hard for people to understand. But sometimes when a computer shows this data, and you can show this model that it's transparent, and this is a model that working well with an open source model, they can, make decisions based on this model better than, just getting a recommendation from a person.
Awesome. Well, thank you. If you don't have anything else to add, Nissim, thank you so much for that. And now we're going to open the floor for any questions. I see a lot of activity in the chat. I'm trying to keep up with some of the things that you've been adding here. Thank you so much for participating. But if anybody has any questions, please add them in the chat. And then if you have a specific question for just the group or if someone in particular, feel free. Will you have more involved training? This is pretty complex, so we will need to review it and then we may have questions. Does anybody want to take that?
I'll take this whole chunk of things. I see a theme here. Locke, I like your comment about the dummies guided deployment. I would say that the answer to Locke's question is probably no, because deployment is going to be very complex. You need to have the right specialists on your team to deploy this. And if you get the right person, they will look at the GitHub repository and go, oh, I know how to do that. And it is, and it's not to diminish this, but there's limits to what, I'll use your word, what a dummies guide can do, because this requires some complex data structures. It requires a database manager. It probably requires some programming skills. And that's why this idea of doing it as a team is really important, where you find people to support your efforts in this. Like anybody can take that GitHub repository and deploy it, but you need to have people who understand what it is. And to David's point, yes, this is complex, and emergency managers do tend to be focused on very hyper-local things. And yet I think for the most part, if you ask them, hey, do you want to provide more equitable service delivery? They will say yes. So it is finding that balance and those people in your community. If you're a small shop in particular, finding the people in your community who can help you with this. And I think that's really important. This is not like, you're not going to go to the repository, download the stuff and install it on your personal computer. For one thing, your IT people will lose their minds, but also you need their assistance in this. Yeah, and that's a great point, Brian, that not everyone has the same questions that they need to answer. And so you have to, this is a tool that is it is a big, broad tool that you then narrow to your community with a team of experts. This is like, I'm a nerd and I wouldn't even attempt to deploy this on my own. I would need people with different skills than I have. I understand how it works, but I cannot program to save my life. I've tried, I have failed, it is not good. And so I know people who can do that. Like I see some of them on this call. And so that's what it takes to deploy this, is the right skill set. It's like anything else. I also would not go get on a fire engine and try to fight a fire. That's not my skill set. I understand how it works, but you don't want me to do it, and I certainly don't want to do it. And this is no different. When we look at specialty areas of what emergency management does, emergency managers are the kind of the glue that holds everybody together, and technology is one piece of that. And so it's important to think about this as another entry into your web of things you got to do or can do, and things you need to coordinate. This is one more thing that you can potentially add to the list that helps make better decisions. So when you talk about decision support, this is a thing you can coordinate, but probably can't do on your own. Just like you can't fight a fire on your own, you can't round up bad guys on your own. This is you may have a role in that, but it's not to actually go do the work. It's to coordinate it and make sure somebody else gets it done. So that's how I would think about this in the realm of emergency management, once it's implemented, you can make way better decisions theoretically, but it's not an implementation that you do on your own.
Is there anything we can use from this now into an equity work?
Absolutely. Like any place that is, like there are some test sites, are there not? Like that data set you had up on your screen was a community that is testing this, wasn't it, Nassim?
Yes, and hopefully in the next version in a few weeks, you will have also like, built surveys that you can start using to input your data about equity and diversity. And of course, you can start using it, and as much people use it, then we get more information and we validate it more. But yes, of course.
And I think it's important to recognize that this is a iterative process. So every time a community uses it, we're going to learn and improve the model. So it's not we're going to download this and it's good forever. It is an iterative process that continues to grow and change as we learn new things. And that's, I think probably the best analogy to that, if any of you have ever turned over your DNA to like 23andMe or Ancestry or any of those companies, they sent you a report about your DNA. And they send you additional reports over time as their data refines things and they learn new things about your DNA. They send you updates. It's not that your DNA didn't change, but the data that they've built around it has changed. And so I think if you think about this in that same sort of framework, that's how this process works. It's iterative. And Suzanne, to your question about doing equity reviews, these models are built per community. So if you had a community that built a model for their community, then yes, absolutely. But you can't build it for someone else's community because you don't have their data. And so it is community specific. And I will say that some of the places that have done this, like I actually think this is less useful at a state level, because you've got like it's already more challenging to do things at that large scale. Where this I think has the most use is at the community level, where you're learning specific things about your specific community based on your specific data.
All right. We have another question here from Nick. So because of the history of things like statistics, we have a hard time deploying AI and machine learning for equity to the point where there has yet to be any good model of equity. What procedures are in place with this group to switch models if the current one is too flawed to really deploy it fully? Great question.
It is a good question, because a lot of time, like I've seen a lot of AI models that just suddenly take a turn and do their own thing, and they scrap them and they start over. And this is an experiment like anything else with AI. I mean, it's not an unfair question because we know the history of AI. AI is built by people, and people don't always do a good job of it. And if you remember the chat bot, you might not remember, but Microsoft, I think, made a chat bot on Twitter, and it was an AI driven chat bot, and it became so profane and mean that they had to shut it off because that's what the bot learned. And yeah, so to Eric's point, this is why we're doing pilots. These are pilots in communities to see if this works well or if it is deeply flawed.
If I may add, Esther, also, I think that the concept and the approach that we're working on this model is different, because we're looking and asking the operational questions that we want to answer at the end. And most of the AI ML models don't succeed because they build great models sometimes and develop great algorithms, but the basic model that they're working on, the data model itself and the data that they're using is not good enough. And this is why 75% of the AI algorithms and models don't succeed. And here we're doing it differently. We went to the end, we asked the decision makers, the emergency managers, the different questions. We're going back, building it from the metric to the KPI and so on, and arranging the data in a methodology and in basic models that when we run on it, the AI algorithm, it will provide a good insight. And of course, at the end of the day, it's an experiment. We're working on it a few months, and hopefully it will be a good one.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. I see here, Deborah. So I noticed that you have weighted some of the input. Can you give an example of these weights and how they were determined? I think she's referring to when you share the screen, ISIM on some of the metrics and that weighing criteria.
So usually we build a generic model with generic weights according to, the interest of what we're looking at. Like we're looking at preparedness, so we manage different lifelines. We're looking at mitigation, so we're looking at different weights. And of course, these weights are going to change because, it's the basic model, it's the first version of the model. And each POC that we're going to do, each webinar that people are going to participate or lunch and learn and add their insights is going to manage the different weights. There's also going to be different thresholds in the model, but this will be the different change. The model is built like a tree. So there's the generic model, and then there's the branches that go according to each community or to each different scenario. So sometimes the model for flood or the model for wildfire will be different and behave a little bit differently. So for now, those are generic weights from our best understanding, of the doctrine of talking to people. And the idea is the work that, for example, Brian and Eric are doing with different different emergency managers will create this fine tuning of the different weights.
I'm actually going to comment really quick on a conversation Ginny and I are having in the chat, and that is that you can use these equity models that you create for your own community to challenge the other things you already have in place.
Right.
And like, I think that when you like that mass notification technology, if you know what equity should look like in your community, when you scope a project of any kind, you can say, and your product, in order to be the successful bidder on this project, your tool has to do X, Y, and Z. And that will push other areas of our industry to make changes. And you talk about the third-party notification tools. Absolutely. Even talk about iPods. Both of those tools are deeply flawed when it comes to equity, deeply flawed when it comes to equity, but we don't really have good data to push back and say, hey, make it better. We can say, hey, make it better with anecdotes, but we could have data that says, here's what our community needs. Can your product deliver this? And pretty soon, companies will start making products that can deliver that.
Thank you all so much for being so engaged. And here, just in terms of some of the resources that I provided at the beginning, I'm not sure if you were able to see them. We're going to drop them in the chat as well. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at equity@spinglobal.org. If you want to participate in a pilot as well, there's going to be a sign up form, or email us if you want to be engaged in a functional pilot. Like you said here, there's a lot of potential to get very specific on things that are not going well in your jurisdiction or your agency, wherever it may be, that we can be that can be used as proof of concept. So thank you all so much again for participating today. And really, this is advancing this effort and building this global community of practice that we're trying to do with this equitable decision intelligence model. And we look forward to working with you in the future as well as this topic progresses. And thank you all so much for your contributions. Have a great day.